In the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe entered a new and intense phase. After the successful Normandy campaign in June and the breakout from the beaches, Allied forces had pushed deep into French territory. Paris was liberated in August, and all of northern France was quickly freed from Nazi occupation. Yet the war was far from over. The German army, though heavily battered, still retained experienced forces, particularly in the rugged terrain near the German border, where they held strong natural defenses reinforced by carefully prepared positions. One of the most critical areas was the Vosges Mountains, a dense, forbidding forested range in eastern France that served as a natural shield protecting Germany. To Allied commanders, the Vosges represented the last major obstacle before reaching the Rhine River Valley, the gateway into Germany itself. Breaking through here meant opening the door to the Reich and forcing the Nazis to confront a direct threat to their homeland. For that reason, the Vosges became a battlefield where the Germans were determined to hold at all costs, and the Allies equally resolved to smash through. It was not just a military clash, but also a symbolic contest of willpower at a pivotal moment of the war. The U.S. 36th Infantry Division, known as the Texas Division, was assigned the mission of attacking in the Vosges sector. The division had a long and hard-fought record, including bloody battles in Italy such as Salerno and Anzio, where they suffered heavy losses but endured. By September-October 1944, the division had been redeployed to France to continue the campaign. Within its ranks was the 141st Infantry Regiment, one of the oldest units in the U.S. Army, with roots in the Texas National Guard. Its soldiers, largely hailing from small towns, farms, and cities across Texas, were bound together by local pride and a strong sense of brotherhood. As the Vosges campaign opened, the 141st Regiment was ordered to advance deep into the mountains to pierce German defenses and clear the way for the 36th Division. At first, progress was steady. German troops resisted fiercely, but were pressured heavily by American artillery and air power. Yet as the regiment pushed deeper, the situation grew more complex. The Vosges terrain, thick forests, steep ridges, and deep valleys, made mechanized movement nearly impossible and often severed communication between units. October's cold, drizzling rain turned dirt tracks into mud, further slowing the infantry's advance. In this difficult setting, 36th Division Commander General John E. Dahlquist made a fateful and controversial decision. He ordered the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry to advance beyond the supporting units and seize a strategic hill deep inside German lines. On paper, this maneuver promised a breakthrough that could disrupt enemy defenses. In reality, it was a perilous order. The battalion was to advance without secure flanks, without strong reserves behind them, and with supply lines stretched thin through treacherous forests. At first, the Texas soldiers pressed forward with determination. They moved through dense woods, skirmishing with scattered German outposts. But the deeper they advanced, the stronger the resistance grew. By this point, they were not merely facing scattered opposition, but entrenched units of Germany's 19th Army, firmly committed to blocking the American advance. Trails were mined, machine gun nests expertly positioned, and artillery already registered to cut off movement. By late October, the 1st Battalion realized it was surrounded. The supply route to the rear had been severed by German forces, and adjacent units on the left and right were unable to link up. Roughly 275 men, officers, NCOs, and infantrymen, were completely cut off in the forests of the Vosges. These Texas soldiers, bound by their shared roots, now faced a life-or-death trial unlike anything they had endured before. General Dahlquist's order has since been judged by many historians as reckless, even negligent. He underestimated both the strength and resolve of German defenders in the Vosges, and ignored field warnings that the terrain was unsuitable for such an isolated thrust. The result was the abandonment of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, left trapped in the enemy's grip, with no resupply, no immediate reinforcements, sustained only by their determination to survive. This episode became known as the Lost Battalion. In truth, they were not lost. They knew exactly where they were. But from the perspective of higher command and in the memory of history, they seemed like a unit abandoned in the wilderness, cut off from the U.S. Army. They fought on, repelling German attacks day after day, but their strength was steadily drained. Ammunition ran low, food dwindled, and water became a precious commodity. Airdrop resupply missions often failed. Parachute bundles drifted into German hands or were swallowed by the trees. The battalion's position was tightening into a deadly trap. In this dire context, the decision to rescue the lost battalion became one of the most difficult and tragic undertakings of the U.S. Army in World War II. It raised painful questions about command responsibility, the value of soldiers' lives, and ultimately drew in one of the most extraordinary units of the entire war. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese-American soldiers fighting to prove their loyalty to a country that had doubted them and confined their families in internment camps. But before their intervention, the nation witnessed one of the gravest command errors of the war, an order that had thrust nearly 300 Texans into a deadly ordeal in the cold forests of the Vosges in October 1944. When the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry, 36th Division, realized they were completely surrounded in the Vosges Mountains, the mood among the hundreds of Texas soldiers changed dramatically. At first, they believed it was only a temporary tactical situation, a German delaying action to slow their advance. They expected friendly forces to break through soon, or that artillery and air power would create a gap for them to withdraw. But as the first day passed, then the second, and every attempt to reconnect with neighboring units failed. The grim reality sank in. They were alone, encircled on all sides by the enemy, trapped in a cold, dark, deadly forest. Their position lay in a densely wooded area, ringed by steep slopes and small ravines. The terrain was both a shield and a trap. It allowed them to hide from direct fire, but made movement, withdrawal, or resupply nearly impossible. The Germans, familiar with the ground and well prepared, quickly tightened the noose. Trails were blocked, open approaches mined or covered by MG-42 machine guns. Communication with the outside world was almost entirely severed. From the outset, the battalion suffered heavy losses from German artillery. Batteries of 105mm and 150mm guns pounded their positions relentlessly. With pre-registered coordinates, every barrage struck with lethal precision, tearing through American concentrations. The deafening blasts shattered the mountain silence. Smoke, dust, and the stench of gunpowder and burning wood filled the air. Each bombardment brought more casualties, some men killed instantly, others gravely wounded and left untreated due to the lack of stretchers and medical supplies. Food soon became the most pressing concern. Cut off from supply lines, the battalion had only limited K rations, designed for a few days of marching, not a prolonged siege. After 2 days, portions were halved, then cut to a third. Soldiers began sharing crumbs of hard biscuits and thin slices of canned cheese. Water also dwindled. Men collected rain in their helmets or drank from stagnant puddles, risking disease. Hunger, thirst, and cold became invisible enemies, gnawing at morale as cruelly as German shells. The only hope of survival came from the air. C-47 transport planes attempted to drop supplies to the lost battalion, but the dense Vosges canopy meant most crates missed their mark, caught in treetops, falling into German hands, or shattering on the forest floor. Occasionally, the Texans retrieved a few packages, but they were pitifully insufficient for nearly 300 starving men. Worse still, one botched drop sent a crate of artillery smoke shells plummeting without a parachute into the American position, killing several. What was meant as rescue from the sky became a deadly gamble, a cruel lottery that inspired little confidence. Meanwhile, the Germans pressed their advantage with probing attacks. By day, they shelled sporadically. By night, patrols and raiding parties crept toward the perimeter. The Americans kept constant guard, straining to catch any sound, branches snapping, footsteps on dry leaves that might signal an assault. Fierce firefights erupted within yards of their lines, muzzle flashes tearing through the night. Ammunition was rationed so tightly that men fired only when certain of hitting their target. Casualties mounted. With no evacuation route, no field hospital, the wounded lay in shallow foxholes, enduring agony. Bandages ran out. Medics tore strips from shirts to dress wounds. Painkillers were almost gone. Each new bombardment claimed more lives, and the dead could not be buried properly, often just covered with a thin layer of dirt or left in the trenches. The grim sight weighed heavily on every survivor. Worst of all was the sense of abandonment. Though they knew friendly forces were trying to break through, each day without rescue deepened despair. Some soldiers began to question the command decisions that had led them into this death trap. Yet discipline and camaraderie held them together. They had no hope of breaking free on their own, but they were determined not to surrender, not to hand their rifles to the enemy. The Germans, sensing their desperation, broadcast propaganda over loudspeakers. In English, they promised food, warmth, safety, if the Texans surrendered. The offers echoed through the woods, but the lost battalion answered with silence or curses. Hungry, thirsty, and shivering, the Texans preferred death in the Vosges to surrendering to the Nazis. In those darkest hours, brotherhood became sacred. Soldiers shared their last crumbs, passed along the final sips of water, huddled together for warmth in freezing nights. Acts of sacrifice abounded. A corporal giving his last ration to a younger comrade. A sergeant, mortally wounded, still directing his squad until his final breath. They fought not just for orders, but for one another, for the brothers beside them. Outside the forest, American units launched repeated attacks to relieve the encircled battalion, but each was beaten back by entrenched German firepower. The Vosges were no easy ground to break. Rugged terrain, cold rain, mud, and fortified defenses exacted blood for every step. The silence from outside told the trapped men all they needed to know. Their comrades were struggling desperately, but success was elusive. By the fourth day, casualties were severe, morale was sinking, and rations were nearly gone. Men chewed on roots and leaves to stave off hunger. The rallying cry, "Hold until rescued," became their shared vow. In truth, without intervention, the battalion faced annihilation within days. At this moment, a decision came down from higher command to send in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Japanese-American unit, to break the encirclement. Though exhausted from previous battles, they were tasked with this life-or-death mission. But before the rescue began, the despair inside the lost battalion had already etched itself into American memory as a tragic symbol, a stark reminder of the brutality of war and the terrible price ordinary soldiers paid for the misjudgments of their commanders. When the lost battalion became trapped deep within the Vosges Mountains, the command of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division and the 7th Army found themselves in a deadlock. Initial attempts to break through with regular forces failed. Other regiments of the 36th tried to push forward but ran into heavily fortified German defenses, camouflaged bunkers, dense minefields, and relentless artillery fire. Each assault was met with heavy casualties, and gains were measured only in a few meters of blood-soaked ground. Time was running out. The lost battalion could survive only a few more days without resupply or rescue. In this desperate situation, Major General John E. Dahlquist, commander of the 36th Division, made a decisive call. He ordered the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, stationed nearby, to undertake the rescue mission. The decision was controversial even within U.S. ranks, as the 442nd had just endured a series of brutal battles and had almost no time to rest. But under pressure from higher command and the responsibility to save the encircled Texans, Dahlquist concluded there was no other option. The 442nd, was one of the most unique units in the entire U.S. Army. Formed in 1943, it was composed primarily of Japanese-American soldiers, Nisei, second-generation immigrants born in the United States. Most came from Hawaii and the West Coast. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans faced suspicion and hostility. Tens of thousands of families were forced into internment camps, stigmatized by the very nation of which they were citizens. Against this backdrop, the formation of the 442nd was both a test and an opportunity, a chance for the Nisei to prove they were true Americans, willing to sacrifice for the Constitution and the Stars and Stripes. Their motto was, "Go for broke," a Hawaiian gambling phrase meaning risk everything for the win. For them, war was not only duty, but also a chance to reclaim honor for their families and community, to show that loyalty was not defined by skin color or ancestry. In over a year of fighting in Italy and then France, the 442nd became one of the fiercest units in the U.S. Army, renowned for courage, breakthrough assaults, and high tolerance for sacrifice. But this also meant they suffered some of the heaviest losses of any unit. Before receiving the order to rescue the lost battalion, the 442nd had already endured over 9 days of continuous marching and combat in the Vosges. They had captured the key towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine at great cost. Casualties were staggering. Many companies were reduced to half their original strength. They lacked replacements, warm clothing, or proper winter gear, still wearing thin summer uniforms in the biting cold of late October. Exhausted, many had gone nights without proper sleep. By all accounts, they should have been pulled back to regroup. But orders from above were absolute. The lost battalion must be rescued at all costs. Dahlquist assembled the officers of the 442nd and gave the mission directly. Both commanders and ordinary soldiers understood the deadly price to come. A frontal assault on entrenched German defenses in the Vosges meant certain heavy casualties, especially for a unit already depleted. Yet no one refused. Beyond discipline, they were driven by conviction. This was another chance to prove that Nisei were Americans and that they would never abandon their comrades. Sending the 442nd was not only a tactical decision, but also a political one. On one hand, the U.S. command needed to save the lost battalion to preserve morale and the honor of the 36th Division. On the other, assigning the 442nd such a perilous mission exposed the paradox of their treatment, trusted to fight, but also considered more expendable than white units. Historians later criticized this as one of the most tragic examples of systemic bias in military command. In the days before the assault, the Nisei soldiers quietly prepared, cleaning weapons, packing gear, tightening the laces of waterlogged boots. Many wrote hurried letters home, leaving them with friends in case they did not return. Some kept small rising sun flags given by their parents when they enlisted, private keepsakes, even though that flag symbolized the enemy. It was a bitter irony that reflected their unique fate, fighting for America while their own families remained confined in U.S. internment camps. On October 26, 1944, the 442nd began its mission. They marched through the forest, advancing toward the encircled Texans. From the outset, they faced fierce resistance. German forces manned dense roadblocks, backed by mortars and artillery. Every yard of progress was bought with blood. Mud, cold, and exhaustion weighed them down, but still they pushed forward. There was no option of retreat. Ahead lay comrades on the brink of annihilation. The image of Japanese-American soldiers braving the Vosges to save white Texas troops became one of the war's most poignant paradoxes. Those once deemed untrustworthy now carried the fate of hundreds of men on their shoulders. They did not fight for immediate recognition. It would take decades before the U.S. truly honored them, but for a soldier's code, never abandon a fellow warrior. To them, the Texans trapped in the Vosges were brothers in arms. Dahlquist's decision, tactically speaking, was the only option left, but in human terms, it was a brutal trade-off. The sacrifices the 442nd would endure far outweighed the number of men saved from the lost battalion. Yet in war, such choices are sometimes inevitable, and the story of the 442nd in the Vosges remains a haunting testament to the terrible price of victory. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team of Japanese-American soldiers entered the battle to rescue the 141st Battalion under circumstances where every factor was against them. After days of continuous marching and heavy losses from previous engagements, their numbers had been severely depleted. Yet under the direct order of the Corps commander, they had no choice. The mission was clear: break through German lines, push into the Vosges forest, and free the trapped Texas soldiers. Nature was their first enemy. By late October 1944, the Vosges Mountains were shrouded in thick fog, while cold rain turned narrow trails into deep mud. Temperatures dropped, yet the men of the 442nd had only thin summer uniforms, as winter coats had not yet arrived. Exhausted, soaked to the bone, their feet swollen from endless marches through mud, they repeated to themselves their familiar motto, "Go for broke, risk everything, hold nothing back." As soon as they left their assembly area, the Nice units faced Germany's layered defenses. Opposing them were not only regular Wehrmacht troops, but also elite SS and mountain units familiar with the terrain. To secure their encirclement, the Germans had laid dense infantry minefields, pre-registered artillery zones ready to fire the instant Americans appeared, and fortified bunkers armed with MG-42 machine guns, the infamous Hitler S buzzsaw with its terrifying rate of fire. For the first 4 days, every step forward cost blood. Companies crawled through minefields, probing with bayonets and shovels under gunfire. Some were wounded simply by slipping in the mud and tripping wires. German artillery smashed the forest, toppling trees and gouging deep craters. Even when the Americans found cover, camouflaged machine gun nests opened fire with devastating effect. At the front lines, acts of heroism unfolded daily. One standout was Barney Hajiro of Company Hua. During an assault up a hillside, Hajiro and his comrades were pinned by machine gun fire. Ignoring his wounds, he charged across open ground, silencing 3 MG-42 positions single-handedly. His courage cleared the way for his company to advance. Hajiro would later be awarded the Medal of Honor, the U.S. military's highest decoration. In another brutal fight, Private George Sakato embodied "go for broke" to its fullest. With his unit suffering severe losses, Sakato led a bayonet charge, personally destroying multiple enemy positions and capturing over 70 German soldiers. His fearless action turned the tide for his company. He, too, was later awarded the Medal of Honor. Yet no individual bravery could conceal the regiment's staggering cost. The rugged terrain denied U.S. artillery and armor any meaningful role, leaving the burden entirely on the Nice infantry. Wave after wave of assaults were repulsed with horrific casualties. Some companies lost over half their men in a single day. Still, the 442nd pressed forward, locked shoulder to shoulder, charging through withering fire to carve a path. By October 29th, the situation had reached a breaking point. Command ordered the 442nd to launch a full-scale assault on a key German stronghold atop a ridge, the gateway to the lost battalion. After limited artillery preparation, the Nice stormed forward. The battle became one of the regiment's fiercest. Many soldiers fought hand-to-hand, using bayonets, grenades, even rocks. Small groups trapped behind German lines fought until every round was spent. Though the toll was devastating, the 442nd seized the high ground. As the fog lifted the next morning, they could finally see signs of the encircled Texans. That sight gave them renewed determination, despite having already suffered hundreds of casualties. Behind the front, medics and nurses worked tirelessly, performing surgeries in the forest under flashlight beams while artillery thundered nearby. Many lightly wounded refused evacuation, begging to rejoin their units so as not to abandon comrades. This spirit of solidarity was the very force that sustained the 442nd's combat strength, even as their casualty rate became one of the highest of the entire war. Tragedy mingled with pride. Each day added new names to the list of dead. Letters home lay unsent, diaries with notes in Japanese and English scattered on the battlefield. Sons of immigrants once confined in America's own internment camps were now falling to save white comrades, men who had sometimes doubted their loyalty. On the night of October 30th, the worst of the fighting had passed. The 442nd, shattered but unbroken, had cut a bloody corridor straight into the lost battalion's perimeter. Deep in the forest, the starving, wounded Texans heard American gunfire closing in. After nearly a week of despair, hope of survival returned. On the morning of October 30th, 1944, the thick fog over the Vosges Mountains slowly lifted, revealing the brutal aftermath of days of fighting. Splintered trees, cratered earth, and countless bodies strewn across the slopes bore witness to the terrible price paid by the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Yet amid the devastation, a new sign emerged. Faint flickers of light deep in the forest. The signal of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry of the 36th Texas Division, still holding out after nearly a week under siege. The 442nd, though decimated, understood they had reached the decisive moment. Companies now reduced to half or even a third of their original strength were ordered to muster everything for one final assault. The Nisei soldiers, nearly exhausted, many limping from wounds, some with bandages wrapped around heads and arms, did not falter. They knew that one more effort could free the trapped Texans. The final attack began in silence. There was no heavy artillery, no tanks to lead the way. The Japanese-American infantrymen crept into the forest, probing for mines, straining to hear enemy movements. Suddenly, bursts from German MG-42s tore through the mist. Men fell instantly, but instead of halting, the companies surged forward, shouting their motto, "Go for broke!" and charged into the German lines. Ferocious close-quarters combat erupted, bayonet against bayonet, grenades exploding within yards, and men fighting until every ounce of strength was gone. After hours of savage fighting, the German defenses broke. As the Nisei pushed deeper, they suddenly heard faint voices calling in English, weak but unmistakable. "We're here! Over here!" It was the sound they had been waiting for. A small 442nd group, led by a sergeant, advanced toward the cries. In the damp forest, they finally saw them. The Texans, gaunt and mud-caked, many wrapped in bloodied rags, struggling to stand. Their eyes lit up at the sight of real comrades breaking through. The first moment of reunion stayed etched in memory. A Nisei soldier extended a cigarette and asked softly, "Need any cigarettes?" The simple question became a symbol, not of victory, but of shared humanity. After all the blood and fire, the first instinct was not boasting of triumph, but offering warmth and comfort to brothers rescued from death's grasp. Inside the perimeter, barely 210 Texans remained able to fight or walk. When they entered the Vosges, the battalion had nearly 275 men. Days without supply, constant artillery bombardment, and repeated German assaults had whittled their numbers down. They survived on meager rations, rainwater and leaves as blankets against freezing nights. Many wounded could no longer rise. The rescue did not end with the first embrace. The next challenge, equally perilous, was to extract the Texans through forests still crawling with Germans. Medics of the 442nd immediately began treating the wounded, binding wounds, injecting morphine, sharing food and water. Many Nisei gave up their last rations to the Texans, knowing their ordeal had been even harsher. In the days that followed, the 442nd fought off counterattacks while carrying the injured out of the mountains. The task was grueling. Steep, muddy slopes doubled the weight of stretchers. 4 men rotated under constant shelling and machine gun fire. At times, when a bearer was shot, another rushed in without hesitation, refusing to abandon the wounded. To the Texans, the arrival of the 442nd was nothing short of a miracle. Many later admitted they had resigned themselves to death, each night believing they would never see home again. When the Nice soldiers appeared, the American flag on their shoulders visible through the fog, the Texans finally believed survival was real. Some broke down in tears, clutching their rescuers, men they had once doubted simply for their ancestry. The reunion carried weight beyond the battlefield. While Japanese-American families remained confined in internment camps back home, their sons shed blood to save white comrades. The sight of Nice rescuing Texans became irrefutable proof of loyalty. Despite injustice and suspicion, they chose to fight to the end for flag and country. By early November, the last of the 141st Battalion had been led out of the forest. The numbers told a grim story. To save just over 200 men, the 442nd suffered more than 800 casualties. Yet in the eyes of the Texans, every drop of sacrifice had meaning, for it had brought them back from the edge of death. Their brotherhood endured for decades, as veterans of both units met again and embraced as family. The moment the battered column emerged from the Vosges, carrying both triumph and grief, entered history as one of World War II's most tragic yet inspiring chapters. The Japanese-American soldiers, once scorned, distrusted, even imprisoned, had proven with blood that loyalty is not measured by race or ancestry, but by action. The rescue of the lost battalion in the Vosges came to an end, but its echoes never truly faded. The cold casualty figures immediately sparked controversy. Only about 211 Texans were saved, while the 442nd Regimental Combat Team suffered more than 800 casualties, nearly 4 times the number of men rescued. This became one of the costliest rescues in U.S. military history, and precisely because of that, it left behind a chain of unanswered questions that lingered for decades. First, the context must be understood. When ordered to carry out the rescue, the 442nd was already exhausted after a string of battles. Their numbers were depleted, with many companies reduced to half strength. Throwing them into what was essentially a suicide mission through rugged terrain against entrenched enemy defenses with little artillery or air support left many frontline officers stunned. They knew the only way to reach the 141st was to launch frontal assaults, a tactic universally taught in military academies as near certain disaster. Yet Major General John E. Dahlquist, commander of the 36th Texas Division, gave a firm order. The battalion must be rescued at all costs. According to numerous memoirs, Dahlquist was known for being impatient, dismissive of defensive or drawn-out solutions. He believed that allowing an American unit to remain surrounded would deal a severe blow to morale, and thus he was willing to pay any price to break the encirclement quickly. For him, symbolism mattered most. He wanted to prove that the 36th Division, which had already suffered heavily in the Italian campaign, could rise again as a resilient unit. His decision to use the 442nd, composed largely of Japanese-American soldiers, raised further doubts. At the time, most of these men's families were still imprisoned in internment camps. They fought to prove their loyalty, and their discipline and willingness to sacrifice were beyond question. Many historians believe Dahlquist exploited this fact. He knew the Nice would never refuse an order no matter how dangerous. They would fight to the last man rather than bring dishonor to their community. For that very reason, some American veterans later derisively referred to the mission as an unnecessary bloodbath. The numbers speak for themselves. Within just a few days, more than 800 soldiers of the 442nd were killed, wounded, or missing. Some companies were reduced to fewer than 20 men. Companies I and K, which spearheaded the assaults, were virtually annihilated. Survivors recalled being unable to remember how many comrades had fallen. The carnage was too fast, too relentless. "We just kept charging. If someone went down, we stepped over them and ran on. If we stopped, the whole line would be wiped out, one Nice veteran remembered. When set against the 200-plus Texans saved, the question is unavoidable. Was it worth it? Had the 141st been captured or forced to surrender, overall losses might have been far lower than the near destruction of the 442nd. Some U.S. officers later bluntly criticized Dahlquist in their memoirs, accusing him of turning the mission into a political showcase rather than a sound military operation. Tensions only grew after the battle. When Dahlquist summoned the 442nd to assemble for commendation, the ranks were so thin that he grew angry, accusing them of lacking discipline and failing to muster. The Nice officers had to explain that most of their men were either dead or in hospitals. That moment left a lasting scar in the memory of many 442nd veterans. They had given everything to rescue the Texans, only to be met with misunderstanding from their highest commander. Still, fairness requires acknowledgement. From a strategic perspective, the successful rescue of the lost battalion carried enormous symbolic value. News of it spread across the United States, lifting morale. It proved that the U.S. Army would never abandon its own, no matter the danger. For families with sons in the 141st, it was nothing short of a miracle, a proof that their children had returned from the edge of death. Yet the contrast between spiritual meaning and human cost fueled debate for decades after the war. Many Nice veterans, even in old age, spoke with bitterness, proud of saving their comrades but unable to forget feeling treated as expendable pawns. One veteran once said in an interview, "We didn't fight for Dahlquist. We fought for the brothers trapped in that forest. If we hadn't saved them, our honor would have meant nothing." On the other hand, the Texans of the 141st never ceased expressing their boundless gratitude. Many kept lifelong bonds with their Japanese-American rescuers, attending reunions together. One Texas veteran said with tears, "If it weren't for them, I'd be dead in the Vosges. Every day I lived afterward was because of the 442nd's blood." That brotherhood became another enduring symbol. On the battlefield, skin color and ancestry vanish, leaving only comradeship sealed in blood. The debates over Dahlquist's responsibility have no final answer. Some historians argue he was simply fulfilling his duty as commander, putting mission first, regardless of casualties. Others contend his decision showed recklessness and a lack of humanity. Either way, history records this truth. The price of rescuing the lost battalion was among the bloodiest paid by the U.S. Army in World War II. The irony is that out of this tragedy, the 442nd secured legendary status. They became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, over 4,000 Bronze Stars, and countless foreign awards. Yet behind the glitter of medals lay immeasurable grief. Each decoration represented a life lost, a family broken, a battlefield memory that haunted survivors for life. When the Nice soldiers returned home, they still faced prejudice. Many came back with chests full of medals, only to be refused service in restaurants while their families remained in camps. That bitter contradiction made the memory of the lost battalion all the more painful. They had proven their loyalty with blood, yet it would take decades before American society fully recognized their sacrifice. Looking back, the price of the lost battalion's rescue was more than casualty figures on paper. It was the price of loyalty tested, of racial prejudice pushed to its limits, and of controversial command decisions. But it was also proof of unbreakable brotherhood, of the creed never to abandon a comrade, and of the ability to rise above prejudice in the fight to survive together. Nearly 80 years later, the battle in the Vosges still poses the same haunting question. What is the limit of the price one should pay for honor and comradeship? For the men of the 442nd, the answer was written in blood on that cold forest ground. Sometimes there is no limit at all. The rescue of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, not only closed a bloody tragedy in the Vosges Mountains, but also opened a new, deeply symbolic chapter in American military and social history. What the 442nd Regimental Combat Team left behind went far beyond the limits of an ordinary battle. It became a powerful testament to loyalty, sacrifice, and the civic spirit of men once doubted and cast aside by their own country. In the immediate aftermath, attention focused on the staggering casualty toll of the 442nd. More than 800 men were killed or wounded to save roughly 211 Texans. That blood price sparked controversy over General John Dahlquist's decisions, but it also underscored the devotion of the Japanese-American soldiers. They had proven that loyalty is not measured by skin color or ancestry, but by what one is willing to stake on the battlefield. And in the Vosges, they had staked everything. After the war, the 442nd became the most decorated unit in U.S. Army history, earning over 18,000 awards, medals, and commendations, including 21 Medals of Honor. In 1962, former President Harry Truman stood before the Nisei veterans and declared, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you have won." That acknowledgement carried immense symbolic weight, for the same U.S. government had once confined more than 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. The spiritual legacy of the rescue also lived on in the lasting bond between the saved Texans and the Nisei veterans. For decades, they held reunions, honored their fallen comrades together, and worked to ensure that history recorded the heavy price paid. To the Texans, the 442nd were not only lifesavers, but true brothers, bound by blood and sacrifice. The social impact of the Vosges victory was profound. The achievements and sacrifices of the 442nd helped reshape American attitudes toward the Japanese-American community. By the 1980s, the movement demanding justice for families once sent to internment camps had gained momentum. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation issuing a formal apology and symbolic reparations to survivors. Throughout that process, the image of the Nisei soldiers in the Vosges stood as undeniable proof of the community's loyalty. Militarily, the rescue of the Lost Battalion also became a classic case study in the cost of tactics, a reminder that a single flawed decision could endanger thousands of lives, and that only extraordinary sacrifice could alter the outcome. The battle served as a warning to commanders of their duty toward the soldiers under them, while also highlighting the tragedy of units treated as expendable. Today, the legacy of the 442nd is preserved not only in history books and museums, but also in community memory, in monuments from Hawaii and California to Texas and Washington, D.C. Japanese-American students, when learning about their forebears, often look to the Vosges as proof of the strength of unity and courage. The rescue of the 141st Battalion was therefore not merely a military event. It was a symbol of justice lost and reclaimed through blood, a message to future generations that loyalty and human dignity cannot be denied by prejudice. If there is one great lesson from the Vosges, it is this: even in the darkest moments, sacrifice and courage can transform how an entire nation views its own citizens.